the secret prayer of Jesus against the fallen, the cry of war that freed humanity. There was something Jesus did when no one was watching, something the Gospels mention briefly, almost casually, yet it carries an immeasurable weight. He would withdraw. He climbed mountains. He walked to desolate places before dawn. And there alone, he prayed. But what exactly did he say in those prayers? Why did he need to isolate himself? And against whom, or against what, were those words directed? Christian tradition speaks of prayer as supplication, gratitude, adoration. But there is another kind of prayer that is rarely taught in churches, a prayer that does not ask, but declares, that does not bow down, but rises up. A prayer that is, in essence, a spiritual cry of war. And it was this prayer that Jesus used against the forces that tried to keep humanity imprisoned. To understand this, we need to go back to the beginning, not to Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, but to the moment he began to comprehend what he was truly fighting against. Because Jesus did not come merely to teach morals or spread love. He came to wage a war, and every war requires a strategy, a weapon, a cry that summons allies and terrifies enemies. Jesus was about 12 years old when he began to realize there was something beyond the visible. It was not a sudden mystical revelation, it was a gradual construction built from disturbing observations. He saw people sick in ways doctors could not explain. He saw good-natured men become monsters in a matter of days. He saw entire communities sunk in despair for no apparent reason. And, most importantly, he saw that many of these evils followed a pattern. They were not random. They were directed. One night, while his family slept, Jesus woke up with a weight on his chest that was not physical. It was as if something invisible was pressing the air around him. He got up, left the house, and walked to a small hill on the outskirts of Nazareth. The sky was clear, starry, but there was a density in the silence. He sat on a rock and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to something that did not come from outside, but from within. And then, for the first time, he heard it, not with his ears, with something deeper. They were voices, whispers, accusations, voices telling humans they were unworthy, that they were condemned, that there was no hope. Voices feeding guilt, fear, division. Jesus opened his eyes, startled. He was not alone. He had never been. And neither was humanity. But most did not know it. He returned home in silence. He told no one. How could he? But something had changed. He now knew there was a battle taking place in a dimension most people ignored, and that this battle determined much of what happened in the visible world. The following years were of silent preparation. Jesus did not merely study the scriptures. He dissected them, searching for patterns, seeking the parts that spoke of spiritual power, authority, names that commanded forces. He observed how the ancient prophets faced resistances that went beyond the human, how Moses confronted not only Pharaoh, but the magicians who channeled strange powers, how Daniel prayed for 21 days because, according to the text itself, an invisible prince blocked the answer. Jesus began to understand the structure. There were hierarchies in the spiritual realm. There were territories, domains, zones of influence. And at the top of this dark hierarchy were the fallen, not ordinary demons, but beings who once dwelt in God's presence and chose rebellion. Beings of vast intelligence, refined strategy, and concentrated hatred against everything that bore the divine image, against humanity. These fallen did not operate alone. They had legions, structures, principalities that governed entire regions, keeping populations in spiritual blindness, powers that whispered lies into the minds of leaders, igniting wars, famines, systemic injustices. There was a plan, and that plan was ancient. When Jesus was in his 20s, he began to develop something no one around him understood, a form of prayer that was not passive. He climbed mountains, as he always did, but now his prayers had a different structure. He no longer merely spoke with God. He confronted forces. He called them by what they were, and he declared authority over them. There is no exact record of the words, but there are scattered evidences in the Gospels. There are moments when Jesus speaks with an authority that is not human, when he tells storms to be still and they obey instantly, when he casts out demons without elaborate ceremonies, without rituals, just with short, direct words, when he looks at Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan," because he recognizes that the voice coming from Peter's mouth was not his. Jesus knew something few know, that words have power. Not empty words, but words charged with legitimate authority, spoken by someone who knows who he is and where that authority comes from. And he knew that the fallen, despite all their power, had a weak point. They had lost their legal position. They were invaders, usurpers, and when confronted by someone with real authority, they had to retreat. Jesus' secret prayer was not a magical mantra. It was a declaration of position. It was him reminding the heavens, the earth, and the abyss where his authority came from. He prayed by reminding God of his ancient promises, reminding the forces of darkness of their announced defeat, and most importantly, reminding himself of who he was. There is a passage most people skim over, Luke 22:43. On the night before the crucifixion, while Jesus prayed in Gethsemane with such intensity that he sweat blood, an angel appeared to strengthen him. But why would Jesus, being divine, need angelic strengthening? Because he was fighting a spiritual battle so intense that his physical body was on the verge of collapse. He was not merely accepting death. He was confronting the full weight of darkness, trying to prevent him from reaching the cross. Because the cross was not just a physical sacrifice, it was the final battlefield. There, Jesus did not merely die for humanity's sins. He disarmed the principalities and powers publicly, triumphing over them. Paul writes this in Colossians 2:15. But to get there, Jesus had to pass through unimaginable spiritual resistance. And how did he do it? With prayer. Not prayer of despair, but prayer of command. He rose from that agony in the garden and walked toward the soldiers because he had already won the invisible battle first. The fallen tried to stop him with fear, with suggestions of escape, with the crushing pressure of what was to come. But Jesus had already declared his position. He had already shouted his cry of war in the heavenly places. And the darkness, though fighting, knew they were lost. There is a detail few notice. When Jesus was arrested, he said to the soldiers, "This is your hour when the power of darkness reigns." Luke 22:53. He acknowledged that there was a permitted moment when the forces of darkness would have apparent victory. But Jesus knew something they did not fully understand, that this temporary victory would be their permanent defeat. Jesus' secret prayer did not end in Gethsemane. It continued on the cross. There are 7 phrases Jesus spoke while dying, but among those phrases, there are silences. 3 hours of total darkness covered the earth. And during that period, something happened that was not recorded in human words. Jesus descended to the lower regions, Ephesians 4:9. He went to the very territory of the fallen and proclaimed his victory over them. Peter writes in his first letter that Jesus, after his death, went and preached to the spirits in prison. He did not preach evangelism, he preached triumph. He went to those who rebelled from the days of Noah and declared that their rebellion was over, that humanity was no longer under their legal dominion, that the keys of death and hell had changed hands. When Jesus rose, the first thing he did after appearing to Mary Magdalene was to gather his disciples and say something extraordinary. "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth." Matthew 28:18. It was not a casual statement, it was the conclusion of the war. He had faced the fallen at every level, from the wilderness to the garden, from the cross to the abyss, and he had won. But there is something even more radical. Jesus did not keep this authority to himself, he delegated it. "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you," John 20:21, and more. "Behold, I have given you authority to trample on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy," Luke 10:19. Jesus was saying that the prayer of war was not exclusive to him, that his followers could also pray with authority against the forces of darkness. And here is the secret the darkness does not want humanity to discover. That prayer is not just asking things from God, that there is a type of prayer that is declaration, confrontation, exercise of delegated authority. That when a human being, aware of their position in Christ, rises and declares the defeat of the fallen, they have to retreat. Not because the human is powerful in themselves, but because they are operating with an authority that comes from above. Jesus prayed alone because he was learning to fight battles no one else saw. He was developing a spiritual language of command. He was mapping enemy territory and declaring its reclamation. And when he finally commissioned his disciples, he sent them with the same weapon he used, authority in his name. Jesus' cry of war was not given with loud volume. It was given with absolute certainty. It was the declaration that darkness does not have the last word, that humanity is not abandoned, that there is a higher kingdom, a greater authority, and that those who align with that authority can face any force of darkness without fear. Today, most Christians pray asking God to do something, but few pray declaring what God has already done. Few rise with the same authority Jesus delegated and command the darkness to retreat. Few realize that the battle still rages, that the fallen still operate, but that the victory has already been won. It just needs to be applied. Jesus' secret prayer was this: the understanding that the war was real, that the enemy was powerful, but that divine authority was superior, and that with this authority, pronounced with faith, declared with boldness, even the principalities and powers have to bow. This was the cry of war that freed humanity, not a cry of despair but of anticipated victory, not a plea but a declaration. And even today, when someone understands this and prays in the same way, the darkness trembles, because they know that the one who won is alive, and his authority has been shared with those who believe.